IVM.
I want to thank Intel for supporting our show. Do you remember last year when we spoke about how the Intel vPro platform is built for business? Well, I'm glad to say we've kicked it up a notch. That's right, Intel is back with a new and improved version of the platform. The new Intel vPro platform lets you do more of what you want and less of what you don't. So it's better for you and for your IT teams, who really are the backbone of keeping your work-from-home experience easy and enjoyable. I can safely say that the new vPro platform gives you more enterprise efficiency with less constraints. Visit intel.in/morewithvpro, that's VPRO, to discover how you can get more done with less waiting. If you're listening on the IVM Podcast Android app, click the link that's visible to you now.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. Regular listeners will know that on this podcast, we've talked about India's vaccine strategy, the prospects of various vaccine candidates, as well as treatments. But today, we want to talk about what India should do once that vaccine is available, and what India should do also before that vaccine is available. How do we communicate to the broader public about the prospects of the vaccines, about how the vaccine will be delivered in different stages, how it's going to be prioritized for some people. And to discuss this, I have with me Shambhavi and Anirudh. And this episode is really actually inspired by a story in the BBC, which a really fascinating story, really, about a painting from 1805 of a Wadiyar princess. And this appears to be an example, a really early example of using celebrities or using people who are well known to the wider public to promote vaccination. I'll start with you, Anirudh. Tell us about this really fascinating painting.
Thanks, Aditya. So, as you mentioned, this is a painting that dates from 1805, which is just a few years after the conclusion of the Anglo-Mysore Wars. So, Tipu Sultan had been deposed. The former reigning family of the Wadiyars had been restored to power. And just a few years after that, the Wadiyar king, I think his name was Krishna Raja, a 12-year-old boy at the time, got married. And very soon after that, we see this painting. Now, it's an interesting painting for a lot of reasons. For one, for example, it consists primarily of Indian women who are dressed in some pretty elaborate jewelry, and all three of whom are looking at the painter with various expressions. The one who is in the foreground appears to be the youngest of the lot, and she's pointing very subtly towards her left arm. Now, there are multiple theories as to who exactly these women can be. The one that's most recently become popular and is really doing the rounds on social media is that this young lady was actually the queen of the Wadiyars, who had just gotten married to the 12-year-old king, as I mentioned, and that she had gotten vaccinated for smallpox. The argument that is being made is that roughly around this time, the smallpox vaccine had just been discovered. The British were trying aggressively to vaccinate the Indian population, not necessarily out of goodwill to Indians, but more, of course, in order to make sure that colonial administrators couldn't get it from the population. And it appears that as a result of them having restored the Wadiyars to the throne a few years ago, the British had a great deal of influence over the domineering grandmother of the Wadiyar king, who was really the prima donna, the prime mover, really, of the Wadiyar court. And it appears that they managed to get her somehow to get the young princess who had just married her grandson to pose with herself and another royal lady and kind of show the public that, hey, look, we are queens and we have taken the vaccine. So it's not going to ritually pollute you. It's not going to hurt you or your children or your cattle. And you can just get it and it's going to be totally safe. And this might very well be a very early example of a celebrity, somebody who was known by a population, who was trusted by a population by virtue of the position she held, becoming part of an official effort to promote a vaccine. Because, as I mentioned, there's a young queen. There may have been a lot of people in and around Mysore who had just seen her at the public celebrations after the wedding, and who therefore would have taken it a lot more seriously and would have considered it to be essentially a sign of approval from the monarchy, a signal that the vaccine was fine to take and in fact beneficial to take. I of course have my doubts as to whether that is really all that goes into this painting. I'm sure, for example, that a painting of this sort would not have been exposed to the eyes of the general public. As such, it might have been intended primarily to kind of motivate the Indian elites to take it and thence get them to impose it upon the broader population. But I think the underlying idea still stands. Basically, what we're seeing in this painting is, in the early 19th century, an example of an Indian public figure endorsing a vaccine and therefore improving public health outcomes.
Yeah. What's really fascinating is that the smallpox vaccine, in this present form at least, was a fairly new thing. For many centuries before, the so-called variolation methods had been tried, where you basically took the pus from a smallpox blister and gave it to young children, and they would get some variant of the smallpox, and eventually most of them would develop some degree of immunity to the disease. What was different about this vaccine was that it began with the so-called cowpox, which is really the origins of smallpox, and a British biologist named Edward Jenner, who had in the 1790s, of course, famously noticed that dairy maids in Britain seemed to be largely immune from smallpox, and this appeared to be because they were contracting cowpox. And what he basically did was he experimented on a perfectly healthy 8-year-old boy, and it seemed to work. This would not pass the ethics board on any vaccination trial today, but it did seem to set the stage for mass inoculations, not just in Britain, but elsewhere in Europe and, of course, in India. And what's also really interesting is that there was obviously resistance to this cowpox-based vaccine in India. Anirudh, how did the British deal with this?
So once again, I'm going to emphasize that all of our sources are primarily colonial, so take this whole thing with a pinch of salt. But basically, the British claim that the Indian population was generally rather suspicious of the vaccine. One can say justifiably, the British didn't exactly have the greatest record in terms of communicating to the Indian population, as we know. Just a few decades ago, for example, there had been a massive mutiny against the British in much of North India, partly because of rumors that the British were trying to defile soldiers by forcing them to consume products of the cow or the pig. So one can imagine that this new Western invention was seen with a great deal of suspicion, especially in southern India and also in northern India, where in a lot of villages which had previously been exposed to smallpox, there were local goddesses who were worshipped as manifestations of the disease. It was considered that the disease was a sign of their wrath, and there were a lot of rituals that are dedicated to, of course, appeasing these goddesses to make sure that they didn't infect children and so on. But the basic idea is that it was a kind of complex social fabric onto which the British were trying to bring this vaccine. There's a religious angle, as I mentioned. There's, of course, the question of ritual purity, which I'm sure a lot of the upper castes were quite concerned about. And that is probably why, for example, the British tried to bring in the Wadiyars and to create this painting, which would have been seen by the upper classes who cared more about ritual purity. But when it comes to the broader masses, we also see some pretty interesting strategies. One, for example, comes from a gentleman called John Ellis, who was an administrator in colonial Madras. Ellis is a fairly remarkable and very interesting character. He's a guy who kind of figured out that Tamil, Kannada, Malayalam, and Telugu belong to a different linguistic family than the Northern or Indo-Aryan languages. He's the first guy who posited the existence of a Dravidian branch of languages. But Ellis was also deeply enamored just generally with Tamil culture. So he's the kind of guy who would sit around and read and try to translate Thiruvalluvar, for example. And he's also a chap who understood the people that he was ruling over very well indeed. According to an interesting article written by a friend of mine, Krishna Parakat, who I'm going to link to in the description, this gentleman created something similar to a Puranic kind of story, which is a dialogue between Dhanvantari, the god of medicine, and Shakti, the great goddess. And Shakti basically explains that this vaccine, the cowpox-based vaccine, was actually a product of the cow. which she had created in order to make sure that people would not get smallpox. And one can imagine that in a population that assigned so much importance to goddesses and their role in the creation of disease, the existence of such a quote-unquote sacred text as this, providing basically divine endorsement for taking the disease, would have really helped a lot of people to get over the apprehensions and go ahead and take the vaccine. So once again, if you were to take this entire picture together, you see the British appropriating Indian elites for an elite audience to kind of convince them that smallpox does not impinge upon ritual purity. And we're looking at the broader mass of the public who tend to believe in a very different kind of, who tend to have very different kind of concerns. You see them bringing in a divine authority, as it were. And keep in mind, of course, that in 19th century India, when just generally religious sites, local dargahs, local temples are such an integral part of social and public life, deities, perceptions of deities, perceptions of saints lead them to behave very much like public figures, and therefore to have the endorsement of a goddess for the vaccine as well managed to bring the larger population on board. So what you see is that there's a kind of nuanced PR strategy in terms of how they're getting people to adopt the vaccine. They aren't just focusing on a single kind of message. Instead, they recognize that the audience is very diverse, that they have different concerns, and they're bringing on different kinds of public figures whose endorsement is taken with varying degrees of seriousness by different sections of this audience to try and convince them to take the vaccine. It's really interesting to think about.
Yeah, this is a really fascinating story, right? Because the same man was also the guy who uncovered what you would now call a deep fake. There was an old forgery from the 17th century, which had been concocted by some French Jesuit priests, pretending to be a Veda translated. And he was one of the people who actually exposed this for the forgery that it was. So it's interesting that he was both involved in creating deep fakes and exposing them. Now, the other really interesting...
I don't know if deep fake is the right word to use, but yeah, he does seem like a very interesting character.
Yeah. And what's also really interesting is that the man who made this painting that sparked off this whole story, and we'll have a link to that as well in the description, it's by Thomas Hickey, who's a well-known portrait artist. He's painted, for instance, there's a portrait of a Bengali lady from, I think, 1787. And you can sense that this painting is really of some artistic merit. It isn't just any other painting. So it involves both a public message, or at least a message for the elites, along with some degree of artistic virtue. All right. I want to move from the early 19th century now to the early 21st century. Doc, what lessons, if any, does this hold for us today?
So I don't think the situation has changed dramatically. Obviously, we do have a vaccine program in India that runs fairly successfully for young children, infants, and expectant mothers. But obviously, COVID-19 vaccine is going to be at a very different scale. And it's a vaccine that is not going to be as exhaustively trialed as some of the others that go through regulation for decades, right? So there might be some hesitancy, some fear, some resistance to being part of the vaccine program. There also is this thing that we are not going to have enough vaccines to vaccinate everybody right from the get-go. It's a fact that we have to accept. So there will be some sort of prioritization where maybe healthcare workers might be prioritized before everybody else. But if there is not clear communication of that strategy to the Indian public, we might see some concerns arising of when am I going to get the vaccine, what happens next. What we have seen over the past few months, particularly from the ICMR, has been very unclear communication strategies. And when things have become known, for example, when they send that letter off to hospitals saying that we have to have this vaccine ready by 15th of August, that has actually caused most mistrust in their capabilities than confidence. So public communication to restore confidence, to let people know that the government is doing something for their benefit and that it's going to take some time, that their health is government's topmost priority, is what is required. And what we have seen over the past 15 minutes is that it cannot be a straightforward, hey, we are there for you, you trust us approach. It has to be weaved into narratives that the public understands and the public connects to. And mostly spoken by people whom the public trusts. This might not always be politicians. This might be other people, other celebrities. And I think we need to figure out what might be the best thing that will work in our current scenario. And this is not just an India-specific story either. The world over, countries have used celebrities to get across this point. And I think one of the most popular thing was when in 1956, Elvis Presley publicly took the Salk vaccine against polio to support the campaign. And that obviously help a lot of people trust the vaccine and take it. So those kind of things is something that we will require going forward. And I think even though vaccine is not yet ready, it's still undergoing trial, approval is still a while away. This is the time for us to start engaging with the public to make sure that they are aware of everything that is happening. People have been locked up for months now, and there is a lot of anxiety that is seeping in. And this might be one way to alleviate that anxiety and prepare the Indian public for the vaccine when it comes.
And I agree, Shambhavi. I mean, it's kind of strange. I feel like the government is perfectly capable of crafting very effective communication strategies when it actually wants to, especially given its close ties with the Bollywood elite, as it were. Right, there are so many actors who are quite outspoken in their support for the ruling party. I think it's theoretically perfectly reasonable to expect that the government should work with them, work with people whom the public are going to trust, and really try to bring the public on board for a vaccine strategy. Because if you look at the way that just generally the COVID pandemic has been managed, as you pointed out, Shambhavi, it's been marked by crossed wires and poor communication from the very get-go. I think a great example is just how lockdowns were first imposed with no clear guidelines on what businesses were allowed, leading to a lot of panic and economic chaos that didn't need to happen. And then once the lockdowns were actually lifted, leaving things in the hands of state governments without a clear strategy, without being able to properly communicate to people what restrictions were there, what really the risks of going out now still are. I think we've seen so far a very lackluster and ultimately very profoundly counterproductive approach to communications that's really only worsened the pandemic. So I think it's very, very important now that the government plays to its established strengths, uses the media apparatus, uses the Bollywood apparatus, or more broadly, just generally film stars, cricket stars, people who have some kind of following, people who would be taken seriously, need to help the public understand this is going to be a process, that vaccines will reach the people who it needs to reach at an appropriate kind of time, and people need to be careful in the interim. There needs to be a much, much better communication strategy in place than we're seeing right now.
Yeah, and I think we are losing kind of the one good opportunity that we had, which is with the IPL, which is ongoing. Because, I mean, this is supposed to be like the biggest IPL. People have been locked in for such a long time. They have not seen active sports or gone out or whatever for such a long time. I think there are like 200 million viewers or something. And it's a great opportunity, a great platform for us to reach out to a lot of people simultaneously. And I mean, it doesn't even have to be about vaccine strategy, right? Aditya and I were talking earlier about why are we not using this platform to talk more about mask wearing. I mean, you have Sachin Tendulkar come on and say that, hey, wear a mask, is probably going to have some influence on the millions of people who are watching him. So why have we not actually been able to use this opportunity strategically to put out messages about public health? You see this message about RBI, you see some of the clubs individually trying to make a difference. But I think we could have done a whole lot more than just wait for the vaccine to come and then think about how we can communicate what's to be done with it.
Yeah, I continue to be mystified about why the central government and state governments haven't done more public messaging about mask wearing. Why celebrities are not on TV or on social media all the time telling people to wear masks. This is something that has had lethal consequences. But I would add that there are many more things that the government can do. And you don't just need, while having IPL cricketers, other sports personalities is absolutely crucial, you can build on that. You can have religious or spiritual leaders. You can have senior politicians, not just from the ruling party, but from the opposition, taken into confidence and spreading the very same message. It's possible to really get a whole cross-section of public figures in this country to talk about the vaccine, to get them on message about the vaccine strategy, about prioritization. And that is just going to make it a lot easier for the government to get the vaccine to the maximum number of people with minimum chaos.
Yeah, you're so right now, Aditya, because now no one has escaped COVID-19, and we have seen religious figures pass away because of it. We've seen politicians pass away. Everyone from Bollywood, the cricketers who have got it. So I think the message is quite clear that no one's immune to it. So we have to get together to make sure that people take the vaccine when it is ready, and people respect the fact that there will be some sort of prioritization mechanism, and it's one for the team. Right, we have to take one for the team. It's kind of like that.
Yeah, that would be a great way to sell it using IPL, right? Absolutely,
and I think it ties into that the underlying elements of the strategy which worked so well in the early 19th century, right? Is that you find the narrative that sells to a particular kind of audience, and you hammer on that in the interest of like a broader public health strategy. So just as Ellis, for example, made up this Purana to convince a somewhat religious society to take a vaccine. I think a very elegant example is how our new national religion, cricket, can be used to convince people that, to take their place, to line up, take the vaccine when it comes to them, and not try to resort to measures like black marketeering or profiteering, which one can expect in Indian context are inevitably going to happen. So it's very crucial to set down the norms, set down the expectations well in advance of whatever vaccine eventually comes out and is administered in India.
I'm so glad we're having this discussion, because a few months back, Pranay and I had put together a document on national security risks during the pandemic. And one of the law and order risks that we had identified was black marketeering, hoarding, stealing of vaccines, whenever they're deployed. But one thing we did not address was precisely this, how you get the public messaging on board and how that can maybe help mitigate some of these problems. So I'm so glad we're having this conversation. Thank you so much, Shambhavi and Anirudh.
Thanks, Aditya.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. I'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Intel, for supporting us. First, right off the bat, want to congratulate Ashton Doctor on celebrating the 300th episode of The Habit Coach. It's a great show. If you haven't been listening to it, listen to it now. And if you listen to it, you can almost go for an entire year with an episode a day. It's really fun. Do definitely check that out. Arjun Koladi, the head of sales for Spotify in India, was on Advertising Is Dead. Do check that out. Really fun show. On Cyrus Says, we had Sumit Basu, the author, fantasy author, one of my favorites. Definitely do check that out. It was Utsav Memorial Week this week on the IVM network. He was on Cyrus Says Cock and Bull on Thursday. He was on Litnama and, of course, his own podcast, Postcards from Nowhere. Do check that out. And one last note before we go. IVM Likes is back, and we've been doing a bunch of interesting conversations about different pop culture things that you might want to check out during the pandemic. Do give it a listen. I'm sure you'll enjoy that. And with that, I hope to see you again next week.
Namaskar, this is Ashish Vidyarthi. Yes, my friend, these are challenging times, but in these challenging times, we can create something extraordinary. Do take time to listen to my podcast, Begin the Journey, available on the IVM Podcast, website, app, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Remember, we have a great opportunity called life. Cheers.